Nobody expected this. But in just a few days, a narrow strip of water most Americans can't even point to on a map has started choking the entire global economy. Over $600 billion in trade moves through the Strait of Hormuz every year, and now it's freezing. Oil prices have already surged past $110 a barrel. And if you're watching from home, this isn't some distant crisis. This is your gas bill, your groceries, your paycheck about to feel the shock. While world leaders scramble, something even more unsettling is happening. Tankers are slowing down. Supply chains are stalling. Entire industries thousands of miles away are already collapsing under the pressure. And the scariest part? This isn't an accident. This isn't chaos. This is control. Because behind the scenes, one country has turned this tiny waterway into the most powerful economic weapon on Earth. And as the world begins to panic, another player, one nobody saw coming, is quietly preparing to flip the entire game. Iran didn't just block the Strait of Hormuz, it redesigned how power works in real time. And the more I look at what's actually happening, the clearer it becomes this is not a shutdown, it's a filter. Instead of stopping all traffic, Iran is allowing only a fraction of ships to pass. Reports suggest as few as 15 vessels a day, compared to over 100 under normal conditions. But here's the key detail most headlines miss. Those ships aren't random. They are selected, approved, controlled. If you're aligned with Iran, or willing to play by its rules, you move. If not, you wait, or you lose everything. And that changes everything. Because nearly 90% of the oil and liquefied natural gas flowing through this choke point is heading straight to Asia. Countries like Japan, South Korea, India, and China. I'm not talking about small disruptions. I'm talking about entire national economies suddenly being forced to compete for limited energy access. In a system they no longer control, you're already seeing the cracks. In the Philippines, a national energy emergency has been declared. In China, fuel prices have surged by around 20%, despite massive reserves built for exactly this kind of crisis. And what that tells me is simple. Even the most prepared countries are struggling to keep up. But here's where it gets darker. Iran isn't just reacting to pressure, it's applying it with precision. By letting some ships through and blocking others, it's effectively deciding which economies keep breathing and which ones start suffocating. No missiles, no explosions, just selective access to the most critical resource on the planet. And while the world debates whether this is a blockade or not, the real question is much more uncomfortable. What happens when control over energy becomes this targeted, this deliberate? Because if you think this is the peak of the crisis, you haven't seen the damage spreading yet. The damage didn't stay in the Gulf. It spread fast, silent, far beyond anything most people expected. What began as a controlled choke point in one narrow waterway quickly turned into a chain reaction, hitting economies that had nothing to do with the conflict itself. In India, nearly 400,000 workers in the ceramics industry were forced to stop working, not because of war on their soil, but because the energy needed to run their factories suddenly became too expensive. Entire production lines shut down. Families lost income overnight. And this wasn't an isolated case. It was a signal. In China, despite having built up months of strategic reserves, fuel prices still jumped by around 20%. That increase didn't just affect transportation. It rippled through food distribution, manufacturing, and daily life. When energy becomes unstable, everything built on top of it begins to crack. Even a country that planned ahead couldn't fully absorb the shock. Meanwhile, Iraq, one of the most oil-dependent economies in the world, also up to 76% of its oil revenue wiped out in a matter of weeks. Kuwait faced similar losses. These are countries whose entire financial systems rely on steady exports, and suddenly that flow was no longer guaranteed. Budgets strained, governments scrambled, and the longer the strait remained restricted, the deeper the damage cut. Global institutions began to sound the alarm. The IMF warned that if disruptions continued, the world could face a new wave of inflation combined with slowing growth, a combination economists fear the most. Not just a crisis, but a prolonged period of instability. The kind that doesn't make headlines every day, but quietly reshapes economies for years. And at the center of it all was a simple, brutal reality. A single choke point controlling nearly a fifth of the world's energy supply had become unpredictable. Not destroyed, not even fully closed, just unstable enough to break the systems that depend on it. What made this moment different wasn't just the scale of the damage, it was the speed. Entire sectors were collapsing within weeks. Governments were reacting, not planning. And no one, not even the largest economies, seemed fully in control of what was coming next. But while most of the world was trying to contain the fallout, there was one country watching this unfold with a very different perspective, because unlike everyone else, it had already lived through this exact scenario and survived it. Ukraine had already seen this movie before, and unlike the rest of the world, it didn't panic when the script began to repeat. Years earlier, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion, one of the first moves wasn't on land, it was at sea. The Black Sea was sealed off almost overnight, warships positioned, trade routes cut, No ships in, no ships out. The goal was simple: strangle Ukraine's economy until it collapsed from the inside. And for a moment, it almost worked. Ukraine was losing nearly $2 billion in annual revenue. Grain exports, feeding entire regions across Africa and Asia, were suddenly frozen. Ports that once handled constant traffic turned silent. Global food prices began to climb. The pressure wasn't just military, it was economic, psychological, systemic. And watching it now, it becomes clear. What's happening in Hormuz isn't new. It's a replay. But here's where the story changes. Ukraine didn't have a navy capable of challenging Russia's Black Sea fleet. It didn't have aircraft carriers or overwhelming firepower. What it had was necessity. And sometimes, necessity forces innovation in a way power never could. Instead of trying to match Russia ship for ship, Ukraine chose a completely different path, one that, at the time, seemed almost desperate. It started experimenting. Small, unmanned surface vessels. Fast, low cost, hard to detect. At first, they were crude, but iteration after iteration, they evolved into something far more dangerous. These weren't just remote-controlled boats anymore. They became precision weapons. Some carried explosives powerful enough to cripple warships. Others were equipped to launch additional drones mid-mission, a layered system constantly adapting, and Russia wasn't ready. One by one, ships were damaged, then destroyed. The Black Sea fleet, once dominant, began to pull back. Not because it was defeated in a traditional sense, but because the cost of staying became too high. Ukraine didn't need to control the sea. It just needed to make control impossible. That shift changed everything. Today, ports like Odessa are active again, handling around 200 cargo ships every month. A blockade that once seemed permanent was broken, not by overwhelming force, but by asymmetric strategy. And this is where it becomes impossible to ignore the connection. Because if you're watching what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now, you're looking at the same blueprint, just in a different region. A powerful force trying to control maritime trade, a weaker side being pushed into a corner, and a global system reacting to the pressure. But here's the question that changes how this entire story unfolds. What happens when the country that solved this exact problem decides to step in? Because Ukraine isn't just observing this crisis, it recognizes it. It understands the mechanics behind it in a way no one else does. And more importantly, it already knows how to break it. And if that knowledge gets transferred, then what looks like a controlled blockade today could become something far more unstable tomorrow. What happened next didn't just change the war in the Black Sea, it changed how modern warfare itself is understood. And if you look closely, you can see why so many countries are suddenly paying attention. Because Ukraine didn't just survive the blockade, it rewrote the rules of how to break one. At first, it didn't look like much. Small vessels, no crews, no flags, just low-profile shapes cutting through open water. But what Ukraine was building wasn't a navy in the traditional sense. It was something far more flexible, far more unpredictable. A network of unmanned surface drones designed to do one thing: make every inch of contested water dangerous. And I want you to really think about this. You're a commander of a massive naval fleet. You have warships, radar systems, missile defenses. You control the sea. And yet somewhere out there, moving fast and almost invisible, are dozens, maybe hundreds of small drones that cost a fraction of your equipment, each capable of disabling or destroying a ship worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That's not a fair fight. That's a shift in reality. Ukraine's Sea Baby and Mura drones weren't just improvised weapons. They evolved into full combat platforms. Some carried explosive payloads powerful enough to cripple large vessels. Others were capable of launching FPV drones mid-mission, extending their reach even further. And because they were unmanned, they could be deployed in ways no traditional navy would risk. And the results were undeniable. Roughly a third of Russia's Black Sea fleet was damaged, disabled, or forced out of key Monotic. Ships retreated, patrol patterns changed. The blockade, once tight and controlled, started to fracture. Not because Ukraine overpowered Russia, but because it made control too expensive, too risky, too unpredictable. And here's where it becomes personal for you. Because this isn't just about military innovation happening somewhere far away. This is about a model, a blueprint that proves something critical. You don't need to dominate to win. You just need to disrupt effectively enough that your opponent can't maintain control. That idea alone is powerful. But what makes it even more explosive is where this knowledge is going next. Ukraine didn't keep this to itself. As global attention shifted to the Strait of Hormuz, and as Gulf states began searching for answers, Ukraine suddenly became something no one expected, a source of expertise. A country in the middle of a war now being asked to teach others how to fight theirs. And I can't stress this enough, this is not theoretical. This is battle-tested strategy, proven under pressure, refined through real conflict. So when Ukraine begins sharing not just its technology, but its tactics, how to deploy, how to coordinate, how to overwhelm stronger forces, it's not just exporting weapons. It's exporting a way of thinking, a way of breaking systems that were once considered unbreakable. And if you connect the dots, the implication is hard to ignore. Because the same type of fast, low-profile attack craft that forced his fleet to pull back could be even more effective in the shallow, crowded waters of the Persian Gulf, against smaller, less armored vessels, against fast attack boats that rely on speed and numbers. In other words, the environment Iran is operating in right now might actually make it more vulnerable, not less. And that's the moment this stops being a regional crisis and starts becoming something else entirely. Because once a strategy like this spreads, once multiple nations begin to adopt it, refine it, scale it, control doesn't just weaken, it collapses. What happened next was something almost no one predicted. Not Washington, not Tehran, and certainly not the analysts who were still treating Ukraine as just a country trying to survive. Because while the world was focused on missiles, airstrikes, and naval patrols, Ukraine had made a move that was quieter, but far more strategic. It stepped into the Middle East. At first, it didn't look dramatic. No headlines about deployments, no large-scale military announcements, just meetings, conversations, visits. But behind those closed doors, something much bigger was taking shape. Ukraine wasn't coming as a victim asking for help. It was coming as a country that had already solved a problem the Gulf states were now facing in real time. And if you think about it, that alone should make you pause. Because countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar are not short on money, weapons, or influence. Yet, in the middle of one of the most critical energy crises in decades, they turn to Ukraine, not the United States, not Europe, for answers. That tells you everything about how valuable Ukraine's experience has become. Zelensky's visit to the region wasn't symbolic, it was transactional. Agreements were signed, long-term ones, not for months, but for years, even decades. These deals covered air defense systems, naval drone technology, electronic warfare capabilities, and the software needed to tie it all together. This wasn't just about buying equipment, it was about importing an entire battlefield doctrine. And I want you to understand what that really means. Because hardware is easy to buy. Anyone with enough money can purchase weapons. But knowing how to use them effectively, how to integrate them into a system that actually works under pressure, that's something entirely different. That's something Ukraine had a hard way. So when Ukrainian experts began traveling to the Gulf, they weren't just delivering technology. They were teaching, sitting side by side with military teams, explaining how to deploy drones in contested waters, how to layer defenses, how to turn weaker positions into strategic advantages. This is knowledge that was built under constant refined in real combat and now being transferred in real time. And here's where it becomes even more interesting. Because these agreements weren't one-sided. The Gulf states weren't just paying in cash. In some cases, they were providing energy resources in return, fuel, financial support, long-term economic backing. It was a swap that made perfect sense. Ukraine offers the tools to reopen critical trade routes. The Gulf states provide the resources Ukraine needs to sustain its own war, a mutual dependency built under pressure. But step back for a second and look at the bigger picture. You're watching a country that, just a few years ago, was almost entirely dependent on foreign aid, now becoming a supplier of military expertise to some of the wealthiest nations on Earth. That's not just a shift in capability. That's a shift in status. And I think this is the moment where the narrative really breaks. Because the world still tends to see Ukraine as the underdog, the one being helped. But what's happening here flips that completely. Ukraine is no longer just receiving support, it's creating value, strategic value. The kind that other nations are willing to invest in, align with, and depend on. And once that happens, the balance starts to move. Because influence doesn't come from sympathy, it comes from necessity. And right now, in the middle of a crisis that is shaking global energy markets, Ukraine has made itself necessary. But there's one more layer to this story, one that turns everything from strategy into something much more personal. Because for Ukraine, this isn't just about opportunity, it's about payback. What makes this moment different, what makes it more than just strategy or opportunity, is the fact that for Ukraine, this is deeply personal. Because the very weapon now being studied, encountered, and exported is the same weapon that has been terrorizing its cities for years. And once you see that connection, it's impossible to unsee it. Russia didn't build its drone war alone. When it needed a scalable, long-range strike capability, it turned to Iran. The Shahed drones, cheap, effective, and designed for mass deployment, became one of the most persistent threats in Ukrainian skies. Night after night, wave after wave they came. Not targeting just military infrastructure, but power grids, buildings, civilian areas. The goal wasn't just destruction, it was exhaustion. And the numbers tell the story. In a single month, Russia launched over 5,000 drones at Ukraine. That's not a tactic, that's a strategy of saturation. And in just a 24-hour period, nearly 1,000 drones were deployed. Imagine that for a second. You're living in a city where the air raid sirens don't stop, where every night brings a new wave, where the sky itself feels weaponized. Ukraine didn't have the luxury of ignoring it. It had to adapt or collapse. So it studied the drones. It analyzed their flight paths, their weaknesses, their cost structure. And what it realized changed everything. These drones were effective not because they were advanced, but because they were cheap and numerous. They overwhelmed traditional defenses by forcing Ukraine to spend expensive missiles on relatively inexpensive targets. That imbalance couldn't continue, so Ukraine flipped the equation. Instead of trying to shoot down every drone with high-cost systems, it began developing interceptor drones of its own. Small, agile, and costing $1,150, designed not to avoid collision, but to seek it, to intercept mid-air and destroy the target directly. And the results were immediate. In some cases, over 70% of incoming Shahed-type drones were neutralized using these systems. Not with billion-dollar defenses, but with something closer to a swarm response. A mirror strategy, cheap versus cheap, mass versus mass, and this is where it becomes more than just defense. Because now, take that same knowledge, the weaknesses the Shahed design, the optimal interception methods, the cost-efficient countermeasures, and imagine it being transferred to the very region where those drones are now being used again. Not against Ukraine, by Iran and its allies in the Middle East. You can see where this is going. Iran helped create a system designed to overwhelm. Ukraine spent years dismantling it. And now, Ukraine is in a position to hand that solution to countries facing the same threat. That's not just irony. That's a full strategic reversal. And if you're watching this unfold, you start to realize something unsettling. Because the weapon that once gave Iran leverage is becoming the very reason that leverage might collapse. Not because it failed, but because someone learned how to break it. And once that knowledge spreads, once multiple nations begin deploying low-cost interceptors at scale, the entire advantage of drone saturation begins to disappear. But here's the part that should make you stop and think. Because this isn't happening in isolation. This isn't just Ukraine solving its own problem. This is Ukraine exporting that solution into an active conflict zone, where the stakes are global, where energy markets are already unstable, and where every shift in capability has immediate consequences. So when you ask what Ukraine is really doing in the Middle East, the answer isn't just cooperation. It's turning years of being attacked into a blueprint for dismantling the very system that made those attacks possible in the first place. And once that process begins, it doesn't just stop at drones. What happens when a battlefield strategy doesn't stay on the battlefield? What happens when it gets packaged, refined, and handed to countries that are facing the same threat in real time? That's exactly where this story is heading now. Because Ukraine isn't just sharing ideas, it's transferring capability. And as those agreements with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar begin to take shape, what's moving into the Middle East isn't just hardware. It's an entire system designed to break control at sea and in the air at the same time. And if you look at it closely, you start to see how dangerous that combination really is. On one side, you have naval drones, the same type that forced Russia's Black Sea Fleet to retreat. Fast, low profile, hard to detect. Capable of striking larger vessels or disrupting patrol patterns. And now imagine those operating in the Persian Gulf, where waters are narrower and are more crowded and filled with smaller, lightly armored, fast attack boats. From a distance, it might seem like Iran has the advantage in that environment. But when Ukraine's model is applied, that assumption starts to break down. Because those smaller vessels, our own strength, also become easier targets, easier to track, easier to overwhelm. And I think this is where the shift becomes clear. Because control in that region has always depended on presence, on being able to patrol, to intercept, to dominate movement. And if every patrol comes with the risk of being hit by an unmanned system that costs a fraction of the ship itself, the entire equation changes. You don't need to sink everything. You just need to make operations too dangerous to sustain. And that's only half of it. Above the water, the second layer is already forming. Interceptor drones, electronic warfare systems, jamming capabilities, all the tools Ukraine developed to counter mass drone attacks. are now part of the package being discussed, transferred, and adapted. This isn't just about stopping ships, it's about neutralizing the air threat at the same time. So now you have a layered response. Sea-based disruption below, air defense run above, electronic interference in between. And when those layers start working together, the result isn't just resistance, it's instability for whoever's trying to enforce control. Now think about that from Iran's perspective. The same drone strategy it used to project power, to overwhelm defenses, to pressure opponents, is now being met with a system specifically designed to dismantle it. Not in theory, but in practice. Tested, refined, proven. I want you to really sit with that for a moment, because this isn't just about matching force with force. This is about turning a strength into a vulnerability. Every drone launch becomes less effective. Every naval maneuver becomes more risky. Every attempt to maintain pressure starts costing more than it gains. And when that tipping point is reached, control doesn't just weaken, it starts slipping. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Because as Ukraine strengthens the Gulf states, as these systems begin to spread and scale, a balance in the region doesn't just shift away from Iran, it shifts away from something else too: traditional power structures. For decades, security in this region depended heavily on a single player, on alliances, guarantees, and military presence that defined who could act and who couldn't. But now, something new is emerging. A model where small, more agile systems can challenge larger, more established forces. And once that model proves itself in one region, it doesn't stay there. It spreads. So when you look at what Ukraine is doing, it's not just helping to solve a crisis. It's introducing a new way of fighting, a new way of thinking about control, and a new kind of vulnerability that didn't exist before. And the moment that spreads far enough, the question is no longer who controls the strait, it's who can still hold control anywhere at all. While the world focuses on the chaos, on rising oil prices, blocked shipping lanes, and escalating conflict, there's a quieter, far more uncomfortable reality unfolding beneath the surface. Because in the middle of all this disruption, there is a country that isn't collapsing, it's benefiting: Russia. And once you see that layer, the entire situation starts to look very different. As oil prices surge past $110 per barrel, global markets react with panic. Energy import nations scramble to secure supply, industries slow down, inflation pressures rise. But for a country whose economy is heavily tied to energy exports, this kind of shock doesn't weaken it, it strengthens it. Russia sells oil, and when oil becomes scarce, expensive, and strategically controlled, Russia's position improves almost automatically. While the Strait of Hormuz becomes unstable, while Gulf exports are restricted, global buyers don't just stop needing energy. They look elsewhere. And one of the few large-scale suppliers still capable of delivering consistently is Russia. So while Ukraine is helping Gulf states counter Iran, while new defense partnerships are forming, and while the Middle East begins to shift, Russia is quietly gaining leverage in the global energy market. And that creates a paradox that's hard to ignore, because Ukraine is actively working against Iran, sharing technology, transferring expertise, helping dismantle the very systems Iran relies on. But at the same time, the instability caused by this broader conflict is pushing oil prices higher, which directly benefits Russia, the country Ukraine is still fighting. It's a loop, a complicated, almost uncomfortable loop. And if you step back, you can see how all these pieces connect. Iran pressures global energy routes. Oil supply tightens, prices rise. Russia earns more. Meanwhile, Ukraine steps into the Middle East, replacing Russian influence in some areas, building new alliances, offering capabilities Russia once provided. So on one side, Russia is losing geopolitical ground. On the other, it's gaining economic strength. And I think this is the moment where things stop being simple. Because conflicts are rarely one-directional. They don't produce clean winners and losers. They create shifting advantages, where one move strengthens you in one area and weakens you in another. For you watching this, it raises a deeper question. What does winning actually mean in a situation like this? Is it controlling territory? Is it gaining allies? Or is it quietly increasing your economic power while everyone else is distracted? Because Russia isn't the one dominating headlines right now. It's not the one making bold new deals in the Gulf. It's not the one positioning itself as the solution. But it doesn't need to. As long as the system remains unstable, as long as its energy remains uncertain, as long as choke points like Hormuz stay under pressure, Russia continues to benefit from a market that is moving in its favor. And that's what makes this moment so difficult to read. Because while Ukraine is rising, while Iran is pushing, while the United States is trying to respond, there is another force in the background. Less visible, less discussed, quietly turning global instability into opportunity. And if that trend continues, the outcome of this entire crisis might not be decided where everyone is currently looking. If you followed everything up to this point, then you already feel it. This isn't just another geopolitical story. This is something bigger. And I'll be honest with you, the most dangerous part of this entire situation isn't what's already happened. It's what happens next. Because what you're watching right now is a shift. Not loud, not obvious, but real. A world where energy can be controlled, not just supplied. A world where smaller, faster, cheaper technologies can challenge entire military systems. A world where countries you never expected suddenly become the ones others depend on. And that should make you stop for a second. Because if Ukraine, whilst fighting a war on its own soil, can step into the Middle East and start reshaping how power works, then what does that say about the system we thought we understood? You've probably been told for years that global power is fixed, that it belongs to a few nations, a few alliances, a few predictable structures. But what you're seeing now breaks that idea completely. Power is moving, fast. And the question isn't whether this crisis will end. It will, one way or another. The real question is what the world looks like after it does. Because once new strategies are proven, once new alliances are formed, once new dependencies are created, things don't just go back to normal. They reset. And I want you to think about your place in that. Because whether it's gas prices, supply chains, or global stability, you're not outside of this. You're part of the system that's being reshaped in real time. So the next time you hear a conflict thousands of miles away, ask yourself something simple. Is this just another crisis? Or is this the moment everything starts to change?